2. David Urquhart, G.J. Harney and Ernest Jones. Whilst he was contributing to the New York Tribune, Marx also worked in the same way for the Urquhartist and Chartist papers. David Urquhart was an English diplomat who, thanks to his detailed knowledge of the Russian plans for world dominance and to his ceaseless struggle against them, had rendered valuable services. Their value, however, he diminished by a fanatical hatred of Russia and an equally fanatical enthusiasm for everything Turkish. Marx was often dubbed an Urquhartite, but quite without justification, and in fact it would be truer to say that, like Engels, he was too much irritated by the foolish exaggerations of the man to appreciate fully his real services. The first mention of Urquhart in the Marx-Engels correspondence is in a letter written by Engels in March, 1853. I am reading Urquhart's book at the moment. He contends that Palmerston is in the pay of Russia. The explanation is very simple. The fellow is a Celtic Scot with a Saxon-Scottish training, by tendency a romanticist, by education a free trader. He went to Greece as a Philo-Hellenist and, after skirmishing around with the Turks for 3 years, he went to Turkey and was immediately seized with enthusiasm for the Turks. He is gushingly Islamitic and declares that if he were not a Calvinist he could be only a Mohammedan. On the whole, Engels found Urquhart's book merely highly diverting. The point of contact between Marx and Urquhart was their common struggle against Palmerston. An article written by Marx against Palmerston for the New York Tribune was reprinted in a Glasgow newspaper where it attracted the attention of Urquhart. In February, 1854, the two met and Urquhart received Marx with the compliment that a Turk might have written the article. However, Urquhart was very disappointed when Marx informed him that he was a revolutionist. Because one of Urquhart's crotchets was that the European revolutionaries were all conscious or unconscious tools of Tsarism used by the latter to embarrass the European governments. The man is a complete monomaniac, Marx wrote to Engels after this meeting, adding that he agreed with him in nothing except with regard to Palmerston, and even then the man had been of no assistance to him. Naturally, these confidential remarks to Engels must not be taken too seriously. Despite all his critical reservations, Marx publicly and repeatedly acknowledged Urquhart's services. And he made no secret of the fact that although he had not been convinced by Urquhart, he had nevertheless been stimulated by him. For this reason he did not hesitate to contribute occasionally to Urquhart's papers and in particular to the Free Press in London, and he also gave Urquhart permission to reprint and distribute a number of his articles in the New York Tribune in leaflet form. These Palmerston leaflets were distributed in fairly large editions, from 15 to 30,000 at a time, and they created a great sensation, but for the rest, Marx gained no greater material advantage from the Scot Urquhart than from the Yankee Dana. Any really close connection between the two was made quite impossible by the fact that Marx supported Chartism, a movement which Urquhart doubly hated as a free trader and as an enemy of Russia, because he thought he could detect the rolling ruble in every revolutionary movement. Chartism never recovered from the heavy defeat it had suffered on the 10th of April, 1848. But as long as its remnants struggled for life, the movement was gallantly and loyally supported by both Marx and Engels, chiefly in the way of unpaid contributions to the papers published by George Julian Harney and Ernest Jones in the 50s. Harney published the Red Republican, the Friend of the People and the Democratic Review in rapid succession, whilst Jones published the Notes of the People and the People's Paper. The People's Paper enjoyed the longest life and was published regularly down to the year 1858. Harney and Jones belonged to the revolutionary wing of the Chartist movement, and amongst all the members of this group they were probably the least insular. They were also regarded as the leading spirits in the International Association of the Fraternal Democrats. Harney was the son of a seaman and had grown up in proletarian surroundings. He had obtained his revolutionary knowledge on his own from the revolutionary literature of France, and Marat was his model. He was a year older than Marx, and whilst the latter was editing the Rheinesiezeitung, Harney was on the editorial board of the Northern Star, the chief organ of the Chartists. Engels visited him in 1843 and Harney described him as a slim young fellow, so youthful that he seemed almost a boy, but even then he spoke extraordinarily correct English. In 1847, Harney made the acquaintance of Marx and joined his circle with enthusiasm. He published an English translation of the Communist Manifesto in his Red Republican, together with an editorial footnote to the effect that it was the most revolutionary document ever published. And in his Democratic Review, he published English translations of articles which had appeared in the Neue Rheinesiezeitung on the French Revolution. declaring that they represented the real criticism of French affairs. In the struggles of the emigration he returned to his old love and came into violent conflict with Ernest Jones and no less so with Marx and Engels. Soon afterwards he went to live on the Isle of Jersey, and after a short stay there he left for the United States, where Engels visited him in 1888. Shortly after this visit Harney returned to England, where he died at a ripe old age and perhaps as the last living witness of a great historical period. Ernest Jones was of Norman descent, but he was born and educated in Germany, where his father was military advisor to the Duke of Cumberland, the man who afterwards became King Ernst August of Hanover. This arch-reactionary rake, who was accused in the English press of every crime in the calendar except suicide, stood godfather to Ernest Jones at the font. But this patronage and the court connections of his parents made no impression on the lad. Even as a boy he showed a vigorous partisanship for the cause of liberty, and as a man he steadfastly resisted all the temptations which were placed in his path and all the attempts which were made to fetter his free spirit with chains of gold. When his family returned to England he was about 20 years old, and he began to study for the bar, to which he was later admitted. He sacrificed all the brilliant prospects which his own high talents and the aristocratic connections of his family opened up to him in order to devote himself to the Chartist cause, which he championed with such fiery zeal that in 1848 he was sentenced to 2 years' imprisonment. As an added indignity for his treachery to his own class, he was treated in prison as a common criminal, but he came out of prison in 1850 as an incorrigible revolutionary, and from the summer of 1850 onwards he maintained close relations with Marx and Engels for almost 20 years. The friendship was certainly not completely cloudless, and troubles such as had arisen with Friley Grot, with whom Jones shared poetic talents, and with Lassalle, on whom Marx's verdict was similar but incomparably more severe, occurred. In a letter written in 1855 Marx refers to him in these words: "With all the energy, persistence and activity for which one must give him credit, he spoils everything by his tub-thumping, his tactless snatching after pretexts for agitation, and his constant impatience and desire to rush ahead of the times." Later on there were even more serious differences between them, particularly when the Chartist agitation went more and more to seed and Ernest Jones began to flirt with bourgeois radicalism. However, basically their friendship remained firm and loyal. During the last years of his life Ernest Jones lived in Manchester, where he died unexpectedly in 1869 whilst still in the prime of life. Engels hurriedly wrote the sad news to London, another one of the old guard gone home. And Marx answered, "The news naturally caused a deep shock to us all, for he was one of our few old friends." A few days later Engels reported that an enormous procession had followed the coffin to the cemetery where still another member of the old guard, Wilhelm Wolff, lay buried. "It was a real loss," declared Engels. After all, his bourgeois phrases had been nothing but hypocrisy, and he had been the only educated Englishman amongst the politicians who had, at bottom, really been on their side.